I've been in a home studio environment for nearly a decade, and let's just say I've had a lot of triumphs, but I've also had a lot of failures. So in today's video, I want to go over 8 mixing tips for the 8 years that I've been producing music in my home studio. Here's the 8 tips coming down the line for you. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and improve your mixes and productions much quicker, not have to figure it out on the fly, and get the help you need. So let's get into the list right now. First mixing tip that I'm going to share is top-down mixing. And I know a lot of people have different opinions on top-down mixing. Some love it, some hate it. Personally, I love it. I think it's perfect for if you're doing your own productions at home. I think there's so many benefits to using top-down mixing. So what is top-down mixing? Basically, top-down mixing means you add a lot of plugins to the buses or the master track of your entire track that you are mixing to get a mixing process going, to help mold the sound very early in the process. This usually involves adding some EQ, compression, saturation, sometimes limiting to the master bus, and then applying processing to the different instrument buses like the drums, the bass instruments, the guitars, the vocals. It really helps you get out in front with your mixing process by processing the individual buses separately, and then you can kind of zero in on the individual instruments. This helps make the mixing process less overwhelming, helps you feel like you're getting somewhere quicker in the process to keep you motivated, and also helps you make big changes and get big wins early in the mixing process. I have a ton of videos on how to create an amazing master bus chain in DAWs like Reaper or just any DAW that you're using. I think it's really advantageous, and it's one of the quickest ways to improve your mixes if you're early in learning this mixing thing, to get somewhere and get a track that sounds really competitive and really solid. Tip number 2 is using high pass filters on your EQ plugins. I know this sounds really basic almost, but if you're new here, I'll explain to you what that is. A high pass filter is basically a band on your EQ plugin that allows you to filter out all the frequencies below whatever frequency you choose. For example, on a vocal track, you may decide to high pass filter, i.e. high pass, letting the high frequencies pass through everything below 100 hertz, where there's just a lot of sub and rumble that's not needed in the vocal. Let me tell you, early on in my mixing process, I did not use high pass filters nearly enough, and all my tracks sounded super muddy, they sounded super cloudy, nothing had any separation or clarity, and I wasn't high passing tracks that clearly needed it, like vocals or lead guitars. Granted, you can go overboard with high pass filtering and high pass everything, and then your track's gonna sound super weak, or you high pass way too high up in the EQ band, 300-400 hertz, which I don't find to be necessary. But applying conservatively, high pass filters on things like vocals, lead guitars, acoustic guitars, even drum cymbals can be really effective at cleaning out the low end rumble that's just not needed. In a bass guitar, sure, we love low end frequencies. We love 70, 80, 90 hertz as it adds that low sub end beef to your track. But on a vocal track, everything below 50, 60 hertz, it's just not needed. To learn to use high pass filters, I have some videos on how to use the basics of EQ and how to use high pass filters, so you can check out those videos there. But really, you want to utilize it in your mix to help create clarity, some separation in your track, and just get rid of frequencies that don't need to be there. Don't sleep on high pass filters, it's super useful. Number 3 is LCR panning. Back in the day, I used to use the weirdest panning situations for my tracks. I'd have things panned 40% to the left, 60% to the left, 30% to the right. I tried all these different combinations to get things to fit in the track, but nothing seems to be as effective as LCR panning, which means you either pan a track dead center, 100% to the left, or 100% to the right. Very rarely, I might pan some percussion things like tambourines or shakers left center or right center, but most of the time I'm sticking with LCR panning things 100% in one direction or keeping it in the center. Another thing here is most people are not listening to music on 2 speakers right in front of them where they can really tell where something sits in the stereo field. A lot of times people are listening to music at clubs or venues or on their phone or really crappy earbuds where it's just not as easy to tell when there's these really specific panning situations. I found that creating clarity, creating punch in your track, the best way to do it, and creating width as well, is creating weight on the widths of your track. When I talk about weight on the widths, I mean adding a lot of tracks to the right and the left to help it add to that width, to help it feel like it's wider in the track as a whole. And I found LCR panning to be the best way to do that. Like I said, maybe some backup vocals, maybe some percussion tracks can sit left center, right center, but a good rule of thumb is to use LCR panning. If CLA does it, I can do it, and I think it works really well. Try using LCR panning if you want to get some better separation on your mixes and overall improve them. And number 4 would be turn down your speakers while you're mixing. This is a big mistake that I think everybody's made at some point. So I'm not singling you out, it's me too, where we want to turn up our speakers super loud when we're mixing because we want to get into the track, we want to hear things super detailed. When in reality, we need to turn down our speakers. We need to get it quieter so we can hear the distinct parts of our track and not make it feel like every move is a giant smear. Also, when you're mixing your track super loud with your speakers, there's something called the Fletcher-Munson curve that comes into effect, where the low and high end frequencies seem super hyped when the track is really loud in your speakers, and you're actually going to get a more flat response when you have the speakers at a lower volume. Also, we're home studio people, okay? This room is not really treated. As long as I have the speakers at a moderate volume where I could talk to someone, like I could talk to you right now, over the track, the room's not really going to play that big of an effect. I can mix the track. The speakers are mostly going to represent what the track sounds like. But if I turn it up super loud, the room's really going to start to come into play. The weird reflections and bounces are going to become a big problem. And if you're in a home studio, that can really mess with your mix. You can start making some not so good decisions when it comes to your low end or the balance of things. So trust me, turn your speakers down. Occasionally you can crank them to see what it feels like when it's turned up, but you should spend 80 to 90% of your mixing time on a nice moderate volume. It's good for your ears as well. And overall, it's just going to help all of your mixing moves. Number 5 is parallel compression. This is a great trick to juice some extra energy out of things like your vocals, your drum tracks, your guitars. It's just a great way to add a little extra layer of solid dynamics into your track. So what is parallel compression? Well, basically, you take a track that you have, let's say it's a vocal, and then in parallel, you absolutely squash and ultra compress a vocal that is a copy of it, and then you bring that volume of that copy into the original vocal. So you have the dynamics of the original, but then you have this super squashed, compressed, energetic version that you mix in to add some life to the vocal. Because when it comes to things like vocals, these tracks are super, super dynamic, but in a mix, they are squashed, they are up front. There's not a lot of dynamics in them, especially in modern music. So using things like parallel compression can add energy and consistency to the volume of a vocal track. This is also great when it comes to drums. Routing things like your kick, snare, and toms to a parallel compression track can add extra energy when those tracks come in, help your kick and snare feel like they have more attack and more meat during the entire mix, and keep them consistent if maybe you're dealing with a more dynamic or not so well played drum performance in your track. And number 6, dial back that reverb and delay. Oh my goodness, I am so guilty of this one. Who doesn't love reverb and delay? And especially when you're in the home studio, you discover your reverb and delay plugin. You're like, this is so cool. It makes my track sound amazing. It's ambient, it's vibrant, and then you stick it on everything. And then your track is one giant ambient mess that you cannot make sense of. Over time, as I've gotten better at mixing and doing this production thing, I've found myself to be more and more conservative with using reverbs and delays. Now, CLA is a mix engineer who loves to use reverb and delays, but he constantly emphasizes that he always brings it down during certain parts of the mix, and also states that if the listener can pay attention and notice that there are reverb and delays in the track, it's too much, it needs to be dialed back. That's a rule of thumb I've taken to, so I'm often using the mix knob when I'm using reverb and delay plugins to dial it back, because really reverbs and delays are going to cause a lot of clouding and a lot of mixing issues in your mix itself. Now, it's cool when applied effectively, so you still need it in there. Leaving everything dry is also another mistake, but over time I've learned to be more conservative with it, be more strategic about using reverb and delay, and it's continually made my track sound more professional and not this crazy sort of 80s washed out sound, much as we love that. And number 7, volume automation. This is huge. This is one I went a long time without even using it all. I would just set the levels of my tracks on my faders, and I would keep it that way through the entire track. No. You want to use volume automation so that you can build dynamics throughout the entire part of the track and make sure everything is at the appropriate volume for each and every section of your track to keep the listener on a journey and experience. Recently, I got a control surface probably a couple years ago, and I love doing volume automation moves on that across the entire track. The key here really is to be conservative with your moves, not 10 dB bumps, 3-4 dB bumps maybe through different parts of the track, to make sure everything is present and upfront and presented to the listener how you want them to hear it. It's just so crucial that you involve this in your mixing tips and your mixing experience, because it really is what takes a decent moderate mix to a pro mixer, is the use of volume automation. It really makes a big difference once you start doing it. And number 8, this might be the most important one, is using some sort of a reference track while you're mixing. Early on, I did not use references, and I would come out with tracks with weird balances, weird EQ curves, things that didn't make sense, things that didn't fit well with the rest of tracks I would hear on streaming services. It was at that point I started bouncing in reference tracks that were in similar genre to what I was working on to get a feel for how things should sound, because our rooms aren't perfect no matter what we do. And especially in a home studio situation, your room's definitely far from perfect. But if you fly in your favorite track, you play it on your speakers, you know what a good track needs to sound like. And if you can bring your track to be a little closer to the reference, not copy it, but get it closer in terms of EQ, balance, top and low end, it's going to go a long ways to helping your track transfer outside of your home studio, which is a big challenge for a lot of home studio mix engineers. They feel like they got it sounding great in their room, they take it out to their car, the whole thing falls apart. Well, using a reference track is the key. A-Bing back and forth to make sure things sound similar is the key to getting your track to transfer to all sorts of listening systems, not just your home studio. So I hope those 8 tips were helpful over the 8 years that I've been producing in the home studio. If you have any questions, leave it in a comment down below. If you're looking for help getting your mixing, your producing, your tracks done in the home studio and just having problems, go ahead and contact me down below. I'd love to help you out with your tracks in the home studio. If you're looking for additional free guides, I have something called the Home Studio Toolbox, which is also 100% free, which is a free guide that gives you free tools, plugins, DAW recommendations for building out your home studio. I just want you guys to have the best experience when it comes to making music in your home studio. I thank you so much for watching. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time.